Good morning. My name is Bob Zdenek, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of San Joaquin Valley Housing Collaborative. And welcome to day 2 of our 10th annual anniversary summit, Rethinking Resiliency. And we're delighted you're here to join us. We have 4 workshops today. We've been really informative and great sessions. And so I'm going to just do real quickly before I turn it over to our moderator, is just go over a few housekeeping details and then do a quick recap of yesterday, because we learned a lot. So first is that all the handouts and materials are on Whova. And so please check those out. There's PowerPoint presentations and other links that people are sharing. And if you haven't, please download the Whova application, or you'll be missing a lot of invaluable materials. And we're going to have it on Whova for 6 months. So you don't have to, if you want to look at it next week, or if you're a particular issue, please do. Yesterday's sessions have already been posted due to our very talented conference coordinator, Andrea Salas. So that's already on the board. And look at the community board on the left side. And sort of share photos, ideas, make this as interactive as possible, since you're doing this from, Zoom land and Whova land. So I think those are the sort of logistics right now. And so what I want to do is recap yesterday. We had 4 sessions yesterday. My mind is still expanding. I learned so much from these diverse sessions. The first one, we had a plenary where we had the Roadmap 2030, the Housing Roadmap 2030 introduced and explained. And it's really exciting because we are so far behind on affordable housing production for many obvious reasons in California, so and in the San Joaquin Valley. So that framework was really interesting around data, around clarity, around policy, and in a way it provides the roadmap is what it's intended to do. And Housing California and California Housing Partnership were the presenters. Then we also had in the plenary the UC Davis Center for Regional Change talking about some of their research and data. And again, it's a great resource, and it's also on Whova. And we also had the REAP program discussed. I learned more about the REAP program from San Joaquin Council of Governments. So that was the plenary. It was a lot in a relatively short period of time. Then we had 3 workshops that followed it, so which was really informative. The next workshop was really on partnerships between research institutions and grassroots organizing, led by Fresno State and their sociology department, and really innovative what they're doing. And they've actually been able to influence state legislation, which I'm really excited about, because I think bringing research and practice and advocacy is really a core element. That's really what the collaborative is all about, is advancing that work in the next couple of years. So we had that session. Then after lunch, we had I keep saying lunch. You don't really get much of a break if you're with us all day. You get 30 minutes, so you have to have speed eating. I should have told that ahead of time. You come and join us. There's speed eating and speed coffee drinking. But anyway, we had a session on the low-income housing tax credit, and it was California Housing Partnership. It was really good. I actually probably still retain about 70% of it, which is amazing. From the 4% credits to 9%. And what I came away with, which is what a valuable resource they were. They actually had in their title FUN, fun. And I joked with them and said, well, low-income housing tax credit is only fun to accountants and lawyers, because they're the only ones that really understand it, because it's very technical. But it is our best source of rental housing, low-income rental housing. So that was a really important session. And again, PowerPoint and materials are on Whova, so please look those up. And then we ended up with manufactured housing, a really important strategy, and some of the challenges in terms of how manufactured mobile home parks being sold. So many of them, what I learned was that, and I do a lot of work in rural disaster work, it burned down, and the challenge is you have to have foundations before you can rebuild, and the financing and the complexity of it. And I learned a new vocabulary term that I'm going to use: naturally occurring affordable housing. So they refer to manufactured housing as naturally occurring affordable housing. I think of naturally occurring retirement communities, or NORCs. So now we have I think it's always helpful to have acronyms or names that you can use to explain what we do to others, because a lot of people don't understand community affordable housing and community development. So that's a quick recap. Those of you that were, attended the sessions yesterday, feel free to add your thoughts. Please do it on Whova, because again, we want to share information and make it interactive. So that's sort of a quick overview of yesterday, and I don't want to take any more time because I want to hand it over to our panel today, because I know I always joke and say no one's interested in learning about funding sources. They're always the most frequent, best attended workshops are usually around funding sources, and we have really here a great panel. So we're going to talk about new and emerging funding sources, how to get more funding for affordable housing development. And so I'm going to introduce the moderator, Jim Ritchie, who's going to introduce the panel and run the show. And so Jim is Vice President for Northern California for SCS Engineers. So we've got a really interesting, and Jim's a geologist, and I have a lot of respect for geologists. They're really, I think, probably the second most important job in California right now, after firefighters. Jim, don't get, you're behind firefighters right now, but maybe in the winter you'll be the most important job. Hopefully not, because we don't need earthquakes or landslides anymore. So without further ado, turn it over to Jim. Thank you for joining us and for assembling the panel.
Great, thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. Can everybody see the screen? Hopefully that shows up. Yeah, our topic is new and emerging funding sources, how to get more funding for affordable housing development. And we really appreciate the opportunity to present. And we appreciate the summit organizers for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody in the audience for joining. And it's, of course, an incredibly important topic. But today we'll have presentations by the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant Program by Miriam Tesneef Abbasi of DTSC. We'll hear from Alexandra Jarosevich about the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, and from Craig Shields about affordable housing and sustainable communities. And they're both with HCD, Housing and Community Development, State of California. And then lastly, Miguel Arambula with Self-Help Enterprises will give us a real example of how the funding can work. So we're going to go from the theoretical to the practical, and we're happy to do that. As Bob mentioned, I'm a geologist. I lead the environmental services group for SCS Engineers in Northern California. My passion is brownfields and affordable housing redevelopment, and I've had the opportunity to work in that space, and I'm really grateful for that. And that's allowed me to work with regulatory agencies and developers and nonprofits and stakeholders, and it's a gratifying work. So I guess to lead in, everybody knows that there's an affordable housing crisis. There's a gap. There's an economic gap where Black and Native American and Latino and Asian households are more likely than white households to be extremely low income renters. Some not so fun facts are that California has 13 of the 14 least affordable metropolitan areas for home ownerships in the nation. And 52% of our rentership pay more than 30% of their income for housing. That's the second highest in the US. And there are various estimates of the housing shortfall, but it seems like it's in the range of 1.5 million homes. So why does California continually underproduce housing, and what can we do about it? It seems like there are three fundamental issues that constrain the housing, and one is that local governments believe that housing doesn't pay for itself under the current tax structure. So the governments are hesitant to embrace new residential development. Land use entitlement process is influenced by public antipathy, and for high density development, rental housing, and affordable housing in particular. And then many families are just not able to cover the gap, to pay the market rates, to buy or rent. So, of course, back to the topic that there's a large part of the solution is to have funding. And so one of the presentations today is about a new source of funding, and Miriam will talk about that. The other two presentations about funding talk about an evolving set of programs that have been in existence, but that are changing as with the times. So the DTSC, Department of Toxic Substance Control, has a new program that's funded with $500 million, with over $200 million, $276 million for investigation and cleanup, and about $4 million for workforce training for brownfield sites. And those are particularly targeted at disadvantaged communities under State Bill 535. That's funded by proceeds from the cap and trade program in California. The other two programs, by the HCD, the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, and the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, they have funds available as gap funding, and those are specifically for specific residential, mixed-use infill projects and areas, as well as loans. So our workshop is going to talk about state resources that are available for the development of affordable housing in ways that respond to environmental justice concerns, where low-income households are more vulnerable to climate change. There's a lack of resources to respond to climatic shifts, where many areas of California are experiencing extreme weather events, such as heat waves and stormwater flooding and sea level rise. We have some themes that are common to these programs, and one is from cleanup to build up. And the idea is that we're clearing the environmental hurdles prior to or during the infrastructure installation, and then that's followed by construction. Also, that we want to maximize, these programs want to maximize the use of funds by, in the best case, tying work scopes together to maximize the use of funds. And in some cases, if we can tie combine construction with remediation or dovetail grant coverage, it just makes things work all the better. A commonality between the programs is to perform the necessary remediation that unlocks the sites to allow development for housing. And that relies on partnerships between municipalities, space-based developers, and nonprofit developers, but all with an eye towards supporting the low-income and disadvantaged communities, those that are subject to some of the extreme environmental justice concerns that are all too prevalent now. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Miriam Tasnif Abbasi. She is the Brownfields Development Manager for the Department of Toxic Substance Control. She's been with DTSC since 2005, and she's now in charge. She is now in charge with implementing the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant Program. They're DTSC's new more than $2 million program to support brownfield recycling in vulnerable communities. So with that, Miriam, you have the floor.
Do that. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's participating this morning. I'm with the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Jim, could you advance that slide for me, please? And we're not part of the land reuse space at all. We're a regulatory agency. We fall within the California Environmental Protection Agency structure. So I just wanted to put this slide out here so you could see where we fit in with the other Cal EPA organizations. Next slide, please. And so, what we do, once again, has to do with the land, but not necessarily has to do with land use directly. What we do is that we oversee and direct work that's done by environmental consultants. We work with owners, operators, developers, nonprofit organizations, tribes, anyone who wants to take a piece of land and generally has some need or some drive to take this land and bring it to a higher and better use. So oftentimes we see ourselves engaging with the the forces that are driving what we consider to be the recycling of land, taking a piece of land that's blighted, that's underutilized, that's lying fallow, and bringing it to a use that is going to provide some kind of broader community benefit. We do cleanups, we do investigations, and sometimes because environmental issues are not always something that can be addressed short term, we work on a lot of projects where we are dealing with maybe some ongoing environmental impacts through the use of various engineering or administrative controls, where we are able to allow for the safe reuse of the land while still making sure that longer term environmental impacts are addressed. Of course, we do a lot of community engagement. And right now, with the new funding that Jim spoke about, DTSC is in a position where we're able to provide funding for environmental investigation and cleanup. Before this, we talked a lot about, we'd love to help a housing organization build up, on a piece of land, but we weren't in the space where we could provide any sort of assistance other than sort of our regulatory oversight. But we're really, really excited with this new funding that we're finally in a place where we can say, look, we can help you recycle this land, and we can also provide some funding to recycle that land. No, you're good, Jim. I was winding down anyway. Thank you. The term that we use a lot at DTSC, and you'll see this with EPA and other environmental organizations, both regulatory and otherwise, is the term brownfields. So brownfields for us, the way we define it, and it's defined in federal statute as well, is any property where either known or suspected environmental contamination complicates the reuse in some way. And this picture that I have here is sort of like typical, more in an urban area where there's a historic use, maybe a factory, it's been taken down, and you can see the patches of discolored earth. And this is just not limited to urban areas. Brownfields can be created from farm use, from cattle ranching, mills, mines, in addition to a lot of the other urban uses like factories, waste disposal sites, landfills. So one of the interesting things, even vacant parcels can be considered to be brownfields. What we've seen at DTSC and in other organizations who are in this space, that a piece of land that's underutilized for 10, 15, 20 years, it's used, undesirable uses end up there, oftentimes, whether it's drug use or vagrancy or other criminal uses, be even something as simple as dumping. And then there becomes this perception that the site can't be used for productive uses because people think that it's contaminated. And that's where the term brownfields is used. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I just wanted to make sure that I give some contextual information. Next slide, please, Jim. So this is a pie chart that shows our new money. This is a very new program. It's called the Cleanup and Vulnerable Communities Initiative. And so there's my piece, which focuses on grant making for people who want to do investigations and cleanups for sites. But there's also an internal facing enforcement program. There's going to be some community-based initiatives that come out of here. We'll have an environmental justice advisory committee. There's going to be some community benefit agreements and actual grants that will also provide to community members who are going to be working within their communities in the brownfield space. Workforce development is also one where we're working on, where we feel that we've got this large infusion of money that's come into our organization, and we want to make sure that we provide opportunities for mobility in these disadvantaged communities. Our money is focused for disadvantaged communities, and I'll speak a little bit about how we define that in some of my next slides. So my particular program is called the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, or the ECRG. And so, as I mentioned a few moments ago, it's about $200 million. And you'll see that number kind of fluctuating because we're kind of getting out ahead of our full program build. They're always telling me, hey, Miriam, we want to divert money for this cause or that cause. And so I just got tired of saying 276 million and just kind of cut it down to give my management some space to do some other really important things with this money. So that number changes, but I think we're comfortable with the 200 million the way I understand it. And so we'll pay for investigations, cleanups, and community-wide investigations in these areas that we consider to be vulnerable. We're using a database that's developed by one of our sister agencies called the Callan Virus Screen Database. The Callan Virus Screen Database it brings sort of pinpoints the convergence of different socioeconomic factors overlaid on pollution burdens, which are environmental cleanup sites, sites where there's water issues, sites where there's issues dealing with air pollution, and bring these all together to give us a numeric system to help us identify various communities. So we're working on focusing on the areas where the Callan Virus Screen scores are 75% or higher through this competitive application process. No, you're good. Your timing's perfect. You're fine. And so the applications are open to public entities, any form of government agencies, so municipalities, quasi-government agencies, school districts, counties, tribes, nonprofits. And I'm going to zone in into the next slide because this is kind of like a big overview of the highest Callan Virus Screen scores. My next couple of slides kind of zoom in a little bit more to the San Joaquin Valley to show you these areas. So there's two slides. Can we go to the next one as well? I just want to kind of toggle back and forth so you can see what areas we can cover. Great, thanks. If you can go back to the slide before this. That's perfect. And so that sort of shows you what our geography is. But I also wanted to point out that if you have a site, because the Callan Virus Screen scores are set up based on census tracts. And so there may be census tracts that are within a larger area, within a city, within a community of focus, where one census tract may meet that qualification of being in the highest Callan Virus Screen score, but the other one doesn't. And so, recognizing a lot of the issues that come with the Callan Virus Screen scores being more focused on urbanized areas, we wanted to be mindful of rural areas and tribal areas. And so, if there is a reuse that supports a vulnerable population, we can go outside of that highest Callan Virus Screen score area. And generally, what we're looking at is starting a pre-qualifying application in the fall, winters, when we're going to be doing a soft launch, recognizing it's our first time out with this program. So we're using that soft launch or initial application language just so everyone understands that things are not going to be perfect, and they actually may change based on what we see as sort of this definition of our application community. And then probably there'll be another opportunity to apply sometime in the spring. So Jim, if you can kind of move past those geography slides to the one after this, great. And so once again, who can apply? If you're a public entity, if you're a tribe, if you're a nonprofit, then we really want you to try and apply for this money. What's also important to note is that because our money is tied to some concepts in federal statutes, we can't give this funding to anyone who either caused or contributed to the contamination at the site. And that's a very sort of complicated discussion for us, but that's how we bottom line it. Ownership's not required, but that you have to have site access. Oftentimes, we've seen that there are partnerships when it comes to nonprofit housing. We see the public-private partnerships or the public-nonprofit partnerships, sometimes more than one entities all working together, planning a site for redevelopment for nonprofit housing. And so we wanted to be conscious of that the applicant does not have to be the owner, but obviously must have some kind of interest in the site and the development of the site. That cleanup to build up is really important for us, and that's why the sites have to be planned for redevelopment. And of course, for us, nonprofit housing is a really, really important need, and so we support those projects. There, of course, has to be a reason to believe that the site is contaminated, and this can also be like a big, deep rabbit hole, but generally there can't be any environmental enforcement orders on the site because that does complicate things when we're trying to move things quickly. So those are kind of very broadly how you would be eligible to apply for this grant. So what can our grant pay for? Well, we can pay for anything that has to do with an environmental investigation or an environmental cleanup. So all the charges associated with the environmental consultants, their subcontractors, and then generally they sub out to a laboratory as well to have the samples analyzed, equipment and materials that are part of the cleanup process or the process to investigate the site, regulatory oversight fees, whether it's us or whether it's a local agency, whether it's a regional water quality control board, whoever you happen to be working with to provide some regulatory oversight for the cleanup or the investigation. Those fees are also covered. We also have a provision to allow for the purchase of environmental insurance, especially when you're buying a new property. And because we want there to be an investment in the project, we will also cover 5% of the total grant for some staff time to make sure that there is focus on this project, and whatever coordination needs to be done with us and with the other parties involved is done. And so we've got that small provision in there as well, which we're really happy and excited about. So what are we looking at? And what do we want to get out of this grant? We want to work with people in a nonprofit housing space, in the affordable housing space, actually, not necessarily nonprofit. We want to help you reduce environmental uncertainties. We understand that having a site that's near a dry cleaning facility, or that used to be a plating shop, or that used to be an old lumber mill or a mine, or that had some previous ranching activities or farming activities, those all present environmental uncertainties. We want this money to be used to remove those uncertainties. We want to make sure that the land is safe for the proposed uses. We are really sensitive to the interaction of land that's available for affordable housing, and sometimes that land is not in the best condition. We understand that, but we're here to be able to make that space safe. We're here to be able to make that space available for affordable housing uses in a way that everyone can be comfortable. And we're people of science, and so we understand the science, and we can do what is scientifically necessary in order to allow this space to be used for affordable housing. We want to support the land use entities like the municipalities and like the builders. We want to support you in your efforts to revitalize the land and to revitalize the communities and fulfill place-based needs. And that's really what we're hoping as, hoping the outcome of the use of this money is going to be. We're using sort of our tagline that we want to kind of associate the ECRG grant with the word encourage, because we encourage environmental investigation and cleanup, and we're just encouraging everyone to apply. I do want to talk a little bit about how specifically this money can be used. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So, I'm going to talk about some scenarios, a scenario that I've seen a lot, where a nonprofit or affordable housing company discovers that one of the sites that they are planning to be used for affordable housing, they've realized through their phase one or through their due diligence work that, oh my goodness, there's some volatile organic compounds that we've discovered on the site from a nearby dry cleaning facility. So, what do you do? How do you deal with, especially if you hadn't considered that and hadn't thought of that or the cost associated with that? Well, what we would like to see is that you apply for an ECRG grant, and we fund the investigation and support you through the investigation process. As I mentioned before, the grant will pay for all the investigative activities, all the fees associated with getting the answers you need to reduce the environmental uncertainties and make some decisions as to how you want to move forward. So in this particular example, because of the kinds of contamination we see from dry cleaning facilities, we made a determination that you need an actual cleanup system. A soil vapor extraction system is a very common treatment for dry cleaning contamination. And in addition to that, you also need a vapor barrier. For those of us who are involved with construction projects, I'm sure you're familiar with vapor barriers. They can be also used for protection from methane as well. But the vapor barriers include some future ongoing sampling to ensure that the system that's put in place is it is continually effective for the people who live there. But if you get to a point where your ECRG is exhausted, here you are in a situation where you've done your cleanup, you've reduced your environmental uncertainties, you know what's going to happen next, and you now have to find funding to put in this cleanup system. And so one of the things that we want you to do is learn more about the HCD grants and the ways that their grants with my presentation, but I do want to introduce you to Alexandra from HCD. And I wasn't sure, Jim, because I've lost track, are we going to take questions right now, or are we going to hold questions to the end until all the presentations are complete?
I think we will hold questions till the end, unless there are some burning questions that we need to address right away. But otherwise, yeah, we can do that. That'd be great.
Thank you for reminding me. I'm going to turn it back to you or to Alex directly, whichever.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Miriam. Yeah, I'd like to introduce Alexandra Jurasevich. She's a senior housing specialist with HCD, and she's been with them since 2018. And she's focusing on their programs that address the nexus between affordable housing, climate change, such as the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, the Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, and their Transit-Oriented Development Housing Program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, everybody. So during my presentation this morning, I'll provide an overview of the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, also referred to as IIG. I will first provide some background information to the program, and after that, I'll go over the regulatory documents that guide the application process. Jim, you can skip that slide as well. So IIG program is available for the development of infrastructure for affordable housing in ways that respond to environmental justice concerns. The program here is closely connected to the underlying concepts of infill development and smart growth. And I would like to start this presentation by explaining the concepts that helped inform and shape IIG program. Infill development provides broad environmental benefits, which includes reducing sprawl, vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions, and others. So at the local level, these approaches increase walkability, provide a sense of place, and reduce exposure to contamination through cleanup of former industrial sites. Another concept related to our IIG program is the concept of smart growth, which is an approach to development that encourages mixed land use planning, diverse housing and transportation options, development within existing neighborhoods, and community engagement. And some of the principles that are considered to be the foundation of smart growth approach overlap with the concept of infill development. Examples are creating walkable neighborhoods, preserving open spaces and farmland, providing a variety of transportation choices, among others. So next slide, please, Jim. I would like to provide a brief overview of IIG program. So if you're new to the program and would like to know a little bit about IIG history, this next section is going to focus on the main authorities, funding sources, and previous NOFA rounds. So the purpose of IIG program is to implement and interpret IIG statute, which is the Health and Safety Code, which established the program. Program's objective establishes criteria and standards against which we, the department, can determine program performance. And the primary objective of the program is to promote infill housing development. This objective is accomplished by providing financial assistance for capital improvement projects that are a part of or necessary to facilitate the development of a qualifying infill project or a qualifying infill area. And I will go over each one of these concepts later in the presentation. Under the IIG program, grants are available for infrastructure improvements that are necessary for residential or mixed-use infill development projects or areas. A little bit about the history. Since its inception in 2006, funding for IIG program has been provided by two propositions, Proposition 1C and Proposition 1, and Assembly Bill 101. So to give you a sense of history, IIG program was created by Prop 1C in 2006. Since its first round of funding in 2008 until round 5, IIG NOFA issued in 2017. Through funding from Proposition 1C, IIG has awarded $600 million to residential and mixed-use developments. These developments created approximately 13,000 new affordable rental homes for low-income Californians and more than 200 ownership homes for low and moderate-income households. And it funded hundreds of infrastructure projects that were necessary preconditions for this housing. So from new parks, sidewalks, and transit linkages to water services, sewer, and street improvements. Funding for round 6 NOFA and program requirements were provided under Assembly Bill 101. So this is the second funding source. In 2019, California government signed the fiscal year 2019-2020 state budget into law, allocating $1.75 billion to increase housing production, and 29% of these funds, or $500 million, were allocated to IIG program. Third funding source is from Prop 1. In 2017, SB3 placed the Prop 1 housing bond on the November of 2018 ballot. California Prop 1 of 2018 authorized the state to issue $4 billion in general obligation bonds to support housing development, including $300 million for the IIG program. So to give you a sense of our awards, HCD has thus far, over 7 funding cycles, awarded more than $800 million to IIG program applicants. As you can see, in 2008, the amount of notice of funding availability was $240 million. The next one was in 2009 in the amount of $197 million. And then over 7 rounds, $800 million were awarded. The most recent one was this year in the amount of $160 million. So this was a bit about the program background, but how does this program work? So the program is administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. To announce funding to potential applicants and start the application process, we issue a notice of funding availability, also referred to as a NOFA. NOFA is governed by IIG program guidelines, which we usually issue or update at the same time as the NOFA. And the guidelines establish terms, conditions, and procedures for funds awarded through the NOFA. You can find the guidelines and the latest NOFA on IIG website. The latest guidelines and IIG NOFA were issued in May of this year. Next, we're going to go over some basic rules one should know when applying for IIG funds. So to apply for IIG funds, to qualify, the prospective applicants have to first establish if they qualify under the program definition of an eligible applicant. So according to the program rules, eligible applicant means one of the following. So it can be a nonprofit or for-profit developer to apply for a QIP, a locality or city, county, or public housing authority or redevelopment agency. So a locality that has jurisdiction over a QIA, or it can be the governing body of an Indian reservation or rancheria with the jurisdiction over a QIA. Or to apply for a QIP, it has to be a tribally designated housing entity that's a developer of a QIP. As for the eligible projects, I already mentioned that IIG promotes infill development by providing financial assistance for capital improvement projects that are a part of or necessary to facilitate the development of a QIP or a QIA. So what do these concepts mean? Capital improvement project means the construction, rehab, demolition, relocation, preservation, acquisition, or any other physical improvement of a capital asset that's a part of or necessary to facilitate the development of a QIP or a QIA. By a capital asset here, we mean a tangible physical property, and this includes costs directly related to construction or acquisition, including planning, engineering, construction, management, other design work. There's a list of costs that are eligible under the capital asset. What do we mean by qualifying infill project? So qualifying infill project that a CIP has to be a part of is a residential or mixed-use residential development that's located within an urbanized area, that's located on a site that's been previously developed, or that's located on a vacant site where at least 75% of the perimeter of the site adjoins parcels that are developed with urban uses. Qualifying infill area has a similar definition. It pretty much means 2 or more QIPs. The guidelines state that the program grant funds should be used for necessary costs of a capital improvement project. And eligible costs here include the construction, rehab, demolition, relocation, preservation, acquisition, or other physical improvements of one or more of the following. So it can be parks or open space, water, sewer, or other utilities service improvements, streets, construction and improvement, structured parking, transit linkages and facilities including access plazas or pathways, facilities that support pedestrian or bicycle transit, transit mitigation, site clearance. Related to Miriam's program, it can be required environmental remediation that's necessary for the development of a capital improvement project. However, in this case, the remediation should not exceed 50% of the program grant amount. And then there are other costs, not to read all of them. There are some ineligible costs, and this includes parking spaces that's not structured parking, developer fees, site acquisition for housing and mixed-use structural improvements, housing or mixed-use structures, replacement fees for local inclusionary programs. So there is a line of ineligible costs as well. You can find all of this information in our guidelines. I'm just briefly going over some of the major costs. So what does one have to do to qualify? So first one has to comply with the definition of an eligible applicant. And then once the entity complies, to qualify or pass the threshold criteria, the QIP or QIA has to meet all of the following conditions. So both QIPs and QIAs have to have been previously developed or be largely surrounded by development. Has to be located in an urbanized area. Localities have to have housing element compliance. Developments have to include at least 15% of the total residential units to be developed as affordable units. Have to have minimum density requirements. Have to meet net density requirements. And then there's a line of other conditions. One of which is also that the construction shall not have commenced prior to the application deadline. The application selection criteria includes project readiness, affordability, housing density, access to transit, proximity to amenities, and consistency with regional plans. So the applicants first must pass threshold requirements before getting into the scoring section of the NOFA. Funds are then allocated through a competitive process based on the merits of the individual infill projects and areas. So a little bit about the NOFA. So the funds are announced in the Notice of Funding Availability, or the NOFA, which is usually issued at the same time as the updated or evolved guidelines. So the NOFA specifies the details such as the amounts of funds available, minimum and maximum eligible point scores, application requirements, tie-breaking criteria. So there's a list of items that's announced in the NOFA itself. So along with the NOFA, we also issue a refined application for prospective applicants. And then if we take a look at the last issued NOFA released in May of this year, NOFA was in the amount of 160 million. It specified grant amounts and limits. So for this last NOFA, and these amounts vary, minimum grant amount was 1 million, and the maximum grant amount for QIP was 7.5 million. For QIA, the amounts are larger. For minimum grant amount for QIA is 2 million, and the maximum grant amount was 30 million. NOFA also establishes geographic targets. Sorry, Jim, can you just go back to geographic targets that also can vary from one NOFA to another. And in the last round, 45% of funds was allocated to Southern California, 25% to Northern California, 10% to Central Valley, and 10% of funds was targeting counties with a population of less than 250,000 people. And then a little bit about the timeline. Next slide, please, Jim. So if we look at the last round of NOFA, NOFA was released on May 12th, and then applicants got 2 months to prepare an application. Applications were due on July 12th. Awards were announced or will be announced in early October. So in terms of timing, we announced the NOFA, and then 2 months later, applications have to be received. And then 2 or 3 months later, we announced the awards. And then standard agreement comes approximately 90 days after the award notification. I know this is a lot, it's a lot of detail. For any attendees interested in applying for IIG, please contact us. You can either send me an email directly or direct your general questions and comments to the email in the middle of this slide. And then you can also go to our website to see what the guidelines and NOFA look like to get informed. And then another resource is, Jim, if you go to the next slide, to hear about future funding and learn about the existing funding, please subscribe. It's a 2-minute long process. Just fill in your information and you'll get all the information pertaining to your interest. IIG is one of the programs that we offer. Craig is going to explain AHS program, but we have a line of other programs that you might be interested in. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your patience. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Alex. So next up, Craig Shields, who is the Climate Investments Branch Chief for the HCD, is going to talk. He's been working in the field of affordable housing since 1997. He's been with the HCD since 2014. And he leads teams that design and implement the department's affordable housing and infrastructure programs that deal with the nexus between affordable housing and climate resiliency. That's a more than $1 billion annual investment to help address California's housing crisis, and in ways that consider the environment while putting people closer to places they need to be and want to go each day, and encourages improvements to walking, biking, and transit infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig. Craig, you might be muted.
Good morning. Thanks for that great introduction, Jim. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which shares some characteristics with the IIG program that Alex just did a great job of describing. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, here's the goal of our program and how we accomplish it. We start with our statutory requirement of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by encouraging people to drive fewer miles in their single occupancy vehicles, by funding improvements to walking, biking, and transit infrastructure, and most importantly, incentivizing dense housing that is closer to the places people want and need to go each day. The AHS program is funded from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and its quarterly cap and trade auctions. Cap and trade is essentially an emission cap placed on the state's leading industrial polluters. If they can modify their practices to stay within the cap, great. If they can't or choose not to right away, they can buy credits that allow them to continue polluting at the same level for the time being. Where do they get those credits? From the good guys, the companies that pollute less than their allowance. They get to sell the leftover credits, then the state takes a percentage of those sales to fund the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program receives about 20% of the total proceeds, and that often adds up to between $300 and $500 million a year. Next slide, please. So the program is really focused on the reduction of vehicle miles traveled. This graph shows that the transportation sector at the far left is the leading offender in greenhouse gas emissions, and passenger vehicles represent the bulk of those emissions. And then the residential sector, which is on the right, the second to the last on the right, also represents a significant amount of emissions. So the program works to reduce emissions in both of those categories. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, here's the culprit, that shiny automobile that many of us think we couldn't live without. So why do we drive so much? Well, one reason is the lack of housing near jobs and places we need to go. And another is a lack of good low carbon transportation options like clean, safe, and reliable bus systems, bike lanes that don't just abruptly stop from one block to the next, and even safe and accessible sidewalks. Next slide. We don't do an AHSC presentation without this graphic. It really tells the story of a typical AHSC project. These are the type of improvements that the program will fund. Each of these components can make a big difference in walking, biking, and transit experiences, making them safer, more comfortable, hopefully even enjoyable. The Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program is really about connectivity, connecting people with the places they want and need to go each day. It funds housing where there are good low carbon transit opportunities in place. And it will also fund transit and active transportation components to improve connections to existing housing. We often find that our most competitive applications include many of the components shown on this graphic. Next slide, please. The program is organized into 3 project area types, and applicants compete against each other within those categories. The TOD, or transit-oriented development category, those projects must be served by high-quality transit and must include new housing in their proposal. The ICP, or integrated connectivity projects, and RIPA, or rural innovation project areas, cannot be served by high-quality transit, but must be served by qualifying transit and must include transportation infrastructure improvements in their application. The RIPA category is a community with a population of 50,000 or less, but otherwise has similar requirements as the ICP projects. Next slide, please. And to define those big terms we use, high quality transit has a headway frequency of 15 minutes or less during peak hours, and it must operate on a railway or be a bus rapid transit service that operates on dedicated bus lanes. ICP and RIPA projects must be served by qualifying transit, which means it does not operate on a fixed infrastructure and has slightly reduced headway requirements. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a TOD, or transit-oriented development project that was awarded a couple of years ago. This is a 100% affordable development located on the site of the former San Francisco Elevated Central Freeway that was demolished following the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. In 2008, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors approved legislation that created several new zoning controls to reduce parking requirements and encourage housing and services without adding cars and parking. This project is really exciting because here it is, a transit-oriented development project with no parking that is built on former freeway land. So I just love this one. Earlier proposals for this site included dozens of structured parking spaces. This proposal, as built, was approved without a single structured parking place, further encouraging walking, biking, and transit use. Here is an integrated connectivity project in San Bernardino. Arrowhead Grove phases 2 and 3 will provide 184 units of affordable housing. In order to close the gaps and increase safety for students and families, a half-mile of sidewalks was constructed along with high visibility crosswalks, and a safe routes to school educational program was funded by the program and will be administered by San Bernardino County. Rural innovation project area projects are for communities with a population of 50,000 or less. The category shares many of the component requirements with the ICP project in the previous slide that has a lower density requirement. RIPA projects often have fewer housing units and may be served by flexible transit. And that's why it's great that they are in their own category and they compete with each other, because they wouldn't do well and didn't do well, as Miguel might talk about later, in our first rounds when we didn't have this target for rural communities. Sierra Village is a great self-help enterprises project in Dinuba that I actually had the pleasure to visit last weekend. Got to see the sidewalks and bike lanes that connect that housing development with the greater community. Now the fun part, where does all the money go? Well, we have 5 categories from which every AHSC dollar must be allocated. Next. The affordable housing development, or AHD dollars, are provided in the form of a loan. And that's the only component that is funded as a loan in this program. All others are grant funded. The current maximum loan amount is $20 million, and individual loan maximums are based on the housing location, the unit size, and the depth of affordability. We have a pretty broad definition of what can be funded with our housing-related infrastructure grant dollars. We just ask the applicant to demonstrate that the component is required as a condition of approval for the project. It often includes really important elements like sewer improvements, curbs and gutters, sidewalks, It's important to note that automobile parking of any kind is not an eligible expense in this program, no matter who requires it. It was in the first round, but we have removed that to further encourage walking and biking and transit. I'm proud to say that the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program is HCD's only program that will fund what we like to call rolling stock: buses, train cars, ferries, even the fleet of bicycles. Adding these elements to the application really helps connect the housing to the community, and it also often provides a GHG reductions scoring advantage. Transit-related amenities are the components that make walking, biking, and transit safer and more enjoyable, like shade trees, comfortable benches, and secure bicycle parking. And finally, we have our programs like walking school buses, bike repair classes, and transit passes that are all eligible grant expenses in the program. We have a host of eligible applicants. Mostly we receive applications from developers, localities, transit agencies, and a few tribal entities. AHSC is a highly competitive program. We are often oversubscribed 2 to 1. We have 3 broad categories of scoring: the California Air Resources Board staff reviews the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, which is very scientifically based evaluation. So our staff is not quite qualified for that. But our team at HCD reviews the policy scoring. Those include criteria like the length of bike lanes that are added, the leveraged financing, and the depth of affordability. Then finally, the Strategic Growth Council staff heads up an interagency team to evaluate the narrative responses like climate resiliency and community engagement efforts. And after 5 rounds of funding, we have a few accomplishments to brag about. We've invested over $1.7 billion. We have funded about 10,000 affordable homes, which is incredible, reduced 2.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and taken 12,000 cars off the road, reducing vehicle miles traveled by 141 million miles every year, which is fairly astounding. And then finally, here are some resources for additional information. We share administration of the program with the Strategic Growth Council. So both the SGC and the HCD websites are good resources for information. The SGC webpage is a little more heavy in policy and technical assistance information. And then the HCD webpage has the notice of funding availability, the guidelines, the application, those materials that are really important in actually applying to the program. So thanks so much. I'm looking forward to hearing Miguel talk about Self-Help Enterprises experience. I hope it wasn't too painful. I know that the program is challenging, but the rewards are great. We provide up to $30 million per project. So we hope it's worthwhile. Thanks.
Greg, thanks so much. And so now we move from the programs themselves to how those programs work. And Miguel Arambula, who's the project manager at Self-Help Enterprises, can talk about his case study. He is working with Self-Help, who is a nonprofit affordable housing developer in the Central Valley. And he wears a lot of hats. He works on future project acquisition, due diligence, working with the partners to put together funding, supervising construction, and doing the necessary monitoring and reporting for the various local, state, and federal funding agencies. And Miguel has expressed, his happiness in working with the broadness of the housing policy, which includes the building sciences, public policy, community engagement, architecture, and finance. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miguel to talk about Stonegate Village 1.
Thanks, Jim. And I know we only got a few minutes because we're going to try to leave some time for questions. So I'm happy to keep it brief here and talk about Stonegate Village 1 in the city of Patterson. We just finished completion for that one in November of 2020. It is fully leased up, and we're looking to convert our permanent financing here at the end of the month. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. If you can go to the next slide, please. Here we go. So just a little bit about self-help. We were founded in 1965. We started out with a mutual self-help home building program to help people build their homes and get access to low interest mortgages to be able to move in. We've also started doing rental housing about 10, 15 years ago. We have a very active emergency services and community development arm that helps with providing services like water and sewer to some of the rural communities. We have received some AHSC awards. We got 2 in round 2, and Stonegate Village was a round 3 award. And as part of those, we've put in solar, gray water, some transportation improvements. So we'll get into specifics for Stonegate 1. If you go to the next slide, Jim. So Stonegate 1 was a hybrid 4% and 9% tax credit project. I'll have a slide at the very end about all of the different funding, which can be one of the challenges, just the number of programs sometimes needed to build a project. This project, I'll also show a visual a little later. It's part of a larger subdivision called Stonegate Shire, which includes some of our mutual self-help single-family homes. And so this was an exciting project for us. The first time we were able to kind of combine our apartments directly across the street from our single family. It is dense for rural communities. I think Patterson has less than 50,000 people as a town. I'm pretty sure of that. And so 20 units an acre, it's the largest thing that's been built in that community for a while. One of the big features that it included was that we expanded Cal vans for the first time into Stanislaus County. As Craig mentioned, you know, we included the full gamut of kind of greenhouse reductions where we could, so more sidewalks, more bike lanes, and assisting with the local bus transportation system. And I'll get into our VNEM a little bit later with challenges and opportunities. So next slide, Jim. So this is kind of a big one. This is a Stonegate Shire, a regional view. So if you see the red dot there, that is the location of Stonegate Village 1. And it is off of the 5, and it's about 30 minutes from Dublin Pleasanton, which is the nearest park and ride. And it's about an hour and a half driving without traffic to get to San Francisco. So even though Patterson is traditionally a Central Valley farm community, it has really started to feel the pressure of higher rents and higher home prices related to kind of being a bedroom community to the Bay Area. Next slide. So this is Stonegate Shire from an aerial view. This picture on the left hopefully isn't too small, but these are the 5 phases. The big chunks that you see as parcel A and parcel B are the location of the apartments, and the yellow, brown, and kind of burnt umber is our single family subdivisions. The picture on the right is an aerial view from about a year ago. So you can see some sidewalks there. some nice wide ones too on the right next to Walnut Avenue, which can accommodate separated bike traffic, which makes people feel comfortable. Where you see all the solar panels, those are our apartments. Just past that, you can see we've built the roads and added the first 2 groups of single family homes. And behind that, you might see a big kind of green space with something that almost looks like a flower. And those are 4 baseball diamonds kind of facing opposite directions. And that is a new school. And so our sidewalks and bike lanes help to connect our new housing with the new school. And so like Craig's saying, you know, hopefully everybody's closer to the places they need to go and can have an easy, environmentally friendly way of getting there. Next slide, Jim. So some of the green features, we, as mentioned, brought Cal vans into Stanislaus County. We had active transportation improvements, sidewalks and bike lanes to schools and parks. We put in a new bus pullout and are providing transit passes to our residents. We had a virtual net energy metering pilot project with our local electrical utility district, which was Turlock Irrigation District. This allowed us to aggregate our solar power and to distribute to each resident, which saved us money in the construction and also hopefully is a benefit to everybody in the TID service district, as they'll be able to use that for multifamily going forward. And we're also in the process of adding 6 fast EV charging stations to the project. Next slide, Jim. Oh yeah, challenges and opportunities. So a big one was COVID. This has affected our purchase of the Cal vans. We do have some years to expend the AHSC money for that. That's a sustainable transportation improvement. So we're waiting a little bit, but just COVID affected public transportation in general and people's ability to congregate in shared vehicles. So that was a challenge to implementing some of these HSC requirements, but one that we feel comfortable we can still meet. A challenge was just being part of a larger subdivision. You know, there was kind of an environmental justice aspect where we felt people were getting priced out of their own cities. And so we were very happy to be offering affordable housing that is could be met and rented or bought by local residents. But it was a little bit of a challenge kind of expanding services, utilities, fire and safety into this larger master planned community. You can see the little ABCD of the larger village that we're part of. A nice opportunity, we were able to partner with the Stanislaus Regional Transit and we built the bus pullout. They provided the bus shelter, trash can, solar light, all this kind of stuff. And so that was a really nice relationship that we developed, and the regional transit agency was very happy to have dense housing because they saw that as a way they could increase ridership. And we were very happy to have, you know, transportation resources near our project. That way our residents could get those services. So that was a nice partnership. And that innovating on a timeline is just about our pilot solar project with our utility district. It was exciting to do, but just always a challenge to do it in time. Jim, next slide. So this is the last one here, and it's just about the funding sources. This project was the first to close using the National Housing Trust Fund, which I think did their first kind of funding round in 2018. As mentioned, it was a hybrid project. So we used 4% and 9% over the 2 phases. We did have bonds, our own capital magnet fund. We used HSC. We had the HD loan for the housing development, and we also used STI, TRA, and program funds. We had funds coming in from San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District, City of Patterson, and our own funds, perm loan from California Community Reinvestment Corporation, and Wells provided the construction. So you can look on here, there's about 10 funding sources. And that's partly why it's taken about 9 months to close the permanent financing, just getting everybody on the same page. So that's the project. We're really appreciative to be able to use the AHSC funds on this one. We feel like it can help keep people from just commuting to the Bay from the City of Patterson. It'll help local residents be able to stay there and access, you know, schools and shopping and everything that's nearby. So and Craig, as far as you're concerned, it hasn't been too difficult to work with. It's nice that the housing portion comes in the form of a loan, and the grants, just something to keep in mind is that each organization will need to expend the funds and then they'll get reimbursed. So just make sure if you have some big expenditures that you kind of have the cash flow available to carry that for a couple months. And that's it, Jim.
Well, thank you, Miguel. And thanks to all of our panelists. And I know we got a couple questions from the audience, but Miguel, to you, could you talk a little bit about your experience with the AHSC application and funding process? You know, was it difficult? Was it fairly user-friendly?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little difficult, particularly related to understanding how to quantify the greenhouse gas reductions. That was something I kind of meant to mention in my talk, so I'm glad somebody asked that. We did use a technical assistant consultant to help us with that. And so I would highly encourage people who are thinking about that. I believe we used a company called Ramble, but there are a number out there, and they help just quantify, you know, if we have this many more riders, how many people travel on this street, how many less vehicle miles traveled, is that. So like Craig mentioned, there's a lot of technical aspects to it, and which is above and beyond your kind of normal funding application. So bringing in a consultant who can help with those is very helpful. And I would also just say, you know, collaboration is a big thing. You know, oftentimes you want to show that the improvements you're making are part of larger plans, either at the city or metropolitan planning organization. You know, we worked a lot with TCAG, the Tulare County Association of Governments, that helped with, you know, coordinating our plans. So just, it might take a little longer to make sure that those relationships are developed and you have the support of the other groups, because I think what HSC wants to see demonstrated is that, you know, your housing and your project falls in line with the larger structure of transportation and how things are moving. So I would say it's a little bit extra as far as funding, and I would give applicants should plan on giving themselves a little more time to prepare everything.
Great word from the wise.
I would just add to Miguel's description of the sort of the black hole, which is the GHG calculation. Our applications are all submitted via the FAST, FAAST portal. It's the State Water Board application submittal portal. And once we make awards, once we announce the awards, all the application materials from awarded and not awarded projects are publicly available. So it's a great resource when designing a project to go in, sort of find a project that might be similar to your own and see what elements made it competitive. And all of the materials are in there, the GHG calculations, all of it. So it's a great resource.
That's great. Thanks, Craig. Well, so Craig, a question for you. Can the AHSC be used to rebuild housing that was destroyed by fires?
Sure, we have some particular requirements about the replacement of affordable housing. So essentially, we have to be sure that the application proposes at least the same number of units, size of units, et cetera, as were destroyed. But otherwise, yeah, absolutely.
And does that apply both to the AHSC and the IIG?
Well, the IIG program does not fund the actual housing. It would fund infrastructure in support of that housing. So the requirements are similar, though, that it would have a qualifying infill project, which is the housing, and we would want to be sure that we were getting at least as many housing units as we lost.
Okay, great. So one thing that we talked about as a group before our presentation was how these programs can work together, to fund a project from sort of the environmental through the infrastructure to the building. I don't know, Miriam, can you start off talking about how you might see that transition from the investigation and then into remediation that might be part of the IIG?
Sure, yes, absolutely. So under our program, we can definitely do both cleanup and investigation. But in my conversations with Craig and Alex, it seems that they can also pick up some of these like bigger dollar cleanups that might push us to run out of our money really, really quickly because we're dealing with a much larger volume of projects. And so the example that I gave where a house that's cited for affordable housing, that's made some determination that there's VOC impacts, that could be a situation where we would take care of the thing that only us can take care of, right? The investigation. So we would do the investigation, we would do the cleanup planning, we would approve a cleanup plan, and then they could compete for the HCD programs to pick up perhaps the cost of the cleanup system, which in this case would be a soil vapor extraction system, and the cost of the installation of the vapor barrier and all of the other provisions that come with the vapor barrier in terms of like piping for longer term testing. I think neither one of our programs will pick up any kind of long-term operational costs, but my understanding is that the HCD program can pick up that pretty significant cost of constructing this system that's going to be part of, essentially part of the structure of the affordable housing. And hopefully with the money that's been saved on the investigation using our program and the money that's saved, for implementing the system through HCD, know that both all these programs are competitive, but assuming that the applicant is successful, then there still remains the cost for the long term, which unfortunately neither one of us can fund, but hopefully there's an offset there where we picked up the tab for the most significant costs.
Right. I mean, it seems like a relatively small price to pay. If the upfront, the capital costs and the installation are covered, the long-term O&M might be sort of a subset of that could be planned into the budget.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we've always struggled with is that we do these specific cleanups based on construction design or based on the way the site's zoned. We don't go for cleanup to residential standards. And that is because we are very considerate of the financial constraints of these types of projects, because obviously we want to try and get away with what financially makes sense to provide safety to the occupants. But one of the things that can also be considered, if technically feasible, is perhaps we do a more aggressive cleanup using these funds and not end up with some sort of restriction or some sort of longer term mitigation. So that's also something that we would like to consider. I know our management and the legislators who provided this funding to us, that was also something they were particularly interested in, is if it's possible to use these funds to do cleanup to an unrestricted land use and not have to worry about long-term stewardship, which still is a carrying cost and has some potential issues associated with it. So I think now's the time to think big and think, broader than we had before. And certainly that's a consideration as well.
Right. So in terms of a remediation project where you might have soils that are affected by chemicals, the choice is either to remove those soils or perhaps to cap them in place and have long-term O&M. This might lend itself perhaps to removing those soils or treating them.
Exactly.
Ah.
That's another opportunity I see for shared costs. There's timing of when our applications come out, when HCD's applications come out. Those things have to be worked around. But there could be a case where we pick up part of the bill, and then HCD picks up part of the bill, and we bring this property to unrestricted land use without any need for long-term stewardship, and that's another consideration.
Okay. And you brought up a word, timing. So we heard a little bit of discussion about the timing of the AHSA. So that program, it sounds like ballpark, start to finish, maybe 6 months. Does that sound right, Craig?
So for an AHSC project typically gets started about 2 years after we make the award, and we ask that it's complete within 5 years of the award. And
Okay.
even though we have some pretty strong, what we like to call shovel-ready requirements, applicants are often challenged to really get those shovels in the ground in 2 years. But mostly, and Miguel can comment on that too, that they get there.
And Miriam, as far as your program, what do you expect for the timing? I know it's just coming out now.
Sure. Timing, we are looking at our pre-qualifying application coming out any day now. We're just waiting for management approval on that. It's not going to be the full application. It's more like us still testing the market, like live testing what our applicants are going to look like, what our system looks like, because it's an online system. And then with the actual sort of initial launch of the application coming out sometime late fall, early winter is what we're thinking. The projects that we're looking at 2 years of the environmental work. So the scope of work that we are asking for to be defined in these applications is what environmental investigation and cleanup work do you see yourself doing in the next 2 years? We've got to spend our money completely in 4 years, and that's why we came up with that 2-year timeline, at least for this initial application. And so we hope that we will be able to implement an aggressive investigation and cleanup planning or cleanup implementation schedule with this money, because it's going to be 2 years and then there'll be opportunities to reapply.
It looks like we have one last question. So I think this might be for Craig. What measures are there to address climate change adaptations? What measures are covered as part of your program?
Well, we really look at climate adaptation measures in the narrative portion of the application, and those can be elements like potential seismic events, making sure that the infrastructure proposed is seismically sound, potential flooding events. New developments must minimize increases in the volume and flow of stormwater runoff. Sea level rise is another one, and of course, fire hazards are on all of our minds lately, that the new affordable housing developments include urban hazard reduction methods.
Great.
I was just going to throw in real quick, extreme heat days, Craig.
Yes.
That we often do for our climate mitigation.
Yes. And I watched an interesting segment this morning about essentially about environmental justice and extreme heat. And, low-income communities often have fewer trees and suffer from heat island effects. So that's why it's great that our programs help fund those mitigating measures.
Great. Well, I think I think our time is up. Again, thank you to our panel. Thank you to the collaborative for the opportunity to present, and to the audience for joining us. And there's contact information from each of the panelists if anybody wants to pose follow-up questions and contact us. But thank you again. And Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Good. Thank you, Jim. And on behalf of the collaborative, I really want to thank the panel, Jim, Miguel, Miriam, Alessandra, and Craig. You clearly lived up to the billing of the workshop. New and emerging sources. I was blown away by the funding chart from Self-Help Enterprises. It was textbook. I mean, different funding sources you have, and it made it look effortless. I don't think it was that effortless, but anyway, it was just the array of funding sources were just dazzling. So we know where to go for expertise now. And then also, some of the new funding sources that are maybe not new, but for me they were new. I was really interested because yesterday we did a session on low-income housing tax credits, and I asked the question about environmental remediation, and you can't use the tax credit for the assemblage for remediation. So being able to couple it with the Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities Initiative and some of the other tools, that's how we're going to really advance affordable housing and make sure that it's healthy and safe. So that was really cool. And just, as I said, just the whole array of funding sources and ideas that we have. And again, so I really want to thank the panel, and please, and a lot of this is going to be on Whova. So please, draw from it and look forward to having future sessions that bridge environmental sustainability and climate adaptation with affordable housing. Our next session is going to begin at 11:30, and we've really talked a lot about programs, tools, policies, housing strategies, but without effective leadership, it's limited. So we're going to have our 11:30 session is devoted to innovative leadership. So I hope you'll continue to join us, and we'll see you back in 11:30. So fill up your coffee or whatever you need to do, and we'll see you back in a few minutes. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.